The laughter in the private karate dojo didn't just fill the room. It bounced off the polished cedar walls and echoed with a cruel, rhythmic intensity. At the center of the mat stood a man who believed he owned the very air everyone else breathed. Park was a man of sharp suits and even sharper violence, a high-ranking figure in a circle where power was measured by the weight of one's fist and the depth of one's cruelty. He was wearing a pristine white GI, the black belt tied with a crisp, arrogant knot that signaled decades of training. He looked toward the corner of the room where a woman stood quietly, holding a tray of water bottles and fresh towels. She was wearing a dark blue maid's uniform, the fabric stiff and practical, her hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun. She was middle-aged, her face a map of exhaustion and patience, the kind of person people like Park looked at without ever actually seeing. "Hey, Sarah," Park called out, his voice dripping with a mocking sort of playfulness that made his henchmen lean forward in anticipation. "You've been cleaning these mats for 3 years. You've watched us sweat, watched us bleed, watched us perfect the art of the strike. Tell me, do you think you've learned enough to give the boss a little exercise?" The room erupted again. The younger men, eager to please their leader, hooted and slapped their thighs. They saw a maid in a blue dress. They saw a woman whose only job was to scrub away their sweat. They didn't see the way her feet were planted, perfectly parallel, weight distributed with a mathematical precision that suggested she was rooted into the earth itself. Sarah didn't smile, and she didn't look down. She simply set the tray on a low bench, her movements fluid and devoid of wasted energy. "I am just here to work, Mr. Park," she said, her voice a calm, low hum that seemed to vibrate beneath the noise of the crowd. But Park wasn't looking for an excuse. He was looking for a spectacle. He wanted to humiliate the very idea of service. He stepped onto the center of the mat, beckoning her with a curled finger, a gesture meant to diminish her to the size of a child. "Come on, Sarah. Just a spar. As a joke. Show these boys that even the help can throw a punch." He didn't know that the silence that followed was not born of her fear, but of the sudden, heavy realization that the atmosphere in the room had just changed. The air felt thicker, colder, as if a storm had just walked through the door and closed it behind itself. The dojo was a sanctuary of discipline for some, but for Park and his men, it was a theater of ego. Located in a secluded estate on the outskirts of the city, the facility was state-of-the-art, smelling of expensive floor wax and old incense. Around the perimeter, 20 of Park's most loyal henchmen sat on their heels, their eyes fixed on the mismatched pair. They were young men with scarred knuckles and expensive watches, all of them conditioned to believe that the black belt around Park's waist made him a god. In their eyes, Sarah was a ghost in a blue uniform. She was the one who arrived at 5 a.m. to bleach the showers, and the one who left at midnight after the last bottle of expensive scotch had been drained. She was invisible. She was the background noise of their lives. Sarah stepped onto the edge of the mat, her black sensible shoes clicking softly before she paused to slip them off, revealing calloused, bare feet. She didn't move like someone who was afraid of a beating. She moved like someone who was measuring the distance to a target. Her posture was straight, her shoulders relaxed in a way that felt almost unnatural given the predatory circle of men surrounding her. One of the younger fighters, a hothead named June, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, "Maybe she can use her mop to defend herself. I hope she doesn't get blood on that nice clean uniform." The mockery was thick, a social pressure designed to make her crumble, to make her bow her head and beg to return to her kitchen. But Sarah didn't look at June. She looked at Park's eyes, and then she looked at his feet. She noticed the slight tremor in his left knee, a sign of an old injury he tried to hide with his bravado. She noticed the way he carried his weight too far forward on his toes, an amateur's mistake born of overconfidence. In that moment, a quiet observer might have noticed something else, a small, silver pin pinned to the underside of her collar, barely visible, shaped like a bird in flight. It was a symbol of a life lived before she ever picked up a cleaning cloth, a life of shadowed corridors and missions that didn't exist on paper. The crowd continued to jeer, but the instructor, an older man named Mr. Kim who usually remained stoic in the corner, suddenly straightened his back. He wasn't laughing. He was staring at Sarah's hands, specifically the way her thumbs were tucked and the stillness of her breathing. He had seen that stillness only once before, decades ago, in a place he preferred to forget. The taunts escalated as Sarah took her place opposite Park. "Don't hurt her too bad, boss. We still need dinner," shouted another man, his voice cracking with forced hilarity. Park laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. He began to bounce on the balls of his feet, throwing a series of lightning-fast jabs into the air, the fabric of his GI snapping with every movement. It was a performance, a display of speed meant to intimidate. He was faster than most men half his age, and he knew it. He circled her, his eyes narrowed, looking for the easiest way to end the joke, with maximum embarrassment for her. Sarah remained perfectly still. She didn't bounce. She didn't shadowbox. She stood in a neutral stance, her hands hanging loosely at her sides, her gaze fixed on the hollow of Park's throat. This lack of reaction began to grate on him. Arrogance requires an audience, but it also requires a victim who looks the part. "What's the matter, Sarah? Forgot how to move without a vacuum in your hand?" Park sneered, stepping closer, entering her personal space to see if she would flinch. She didn't. Instead, she spoke, her voice cutting through the laughter like a cold blade. "Your stance is wide, Mr. Park. Your center of gravity is drifting to the right. If you strike now, you will lose your balance." The room went dead silent. The transition from mockery to confusion was instantaneous. It wasn't just what she said, it was the clinical, detached way she said it, as if she were a doctor diagnosing a common cold. Park froze, his face flushing a deep, angry red. The laughter of his men died in their throats, replaced by a sudden, itchy unease. They looked at each other, wondering if they had misheard. A maid was correcting a black belt? A woman who folded their laundry was telling a Mafia boss how to fight? Park's ego, inflated by years of sycophants, couldn't handle the puncture. "You think you can talk to me about balance?" he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. He lunged forward, not with a strike, but with a heavy-handed shove meant to send her sprawling. It was a clumsy, angry move. Sarah didn't step back. She pivoted on her left heel, a movement so small it was almost invisible, and let his momentum carry him past her. She didn't trip him. She didn't hit him. She simply wasn't where he expected her to be. Park stumbled, his lead foot sliding on the mat, and he had to catch himself with a hand to avoid falling. The sound of his palm hitting the mat was like a gunshot in the silent room. The silence in the dojo was no longer empty, it was heavy, pressing against the eardrums of everyone present. Park stood up slowly, his face a mask of humiliated rage. He brushed off his knee, his eyes darting to his men to see if any of them were smiling. They weren't. They were leaning forward, their expressions shifting from amusement to a wary, sharp-eyed curiosity. They had seen something they couldn't explain. "A fluke," Park muttered, though his voice lacked its previous iron certainty. He reset his stance, this time more seriously, his hands coming up into a traditional guard. He wasn't playing a joke anymore. He was trying to reclaim his dignity. "You got lucky, Sarah. But luck doesn't save you from a real fighter." Sarah didn't respond with words. She simply raised her hands. She didn't take a karate stance. Her lead hand was open, her fingers slightly curved, her rear hand guarding her ribs. It was a posture of terrifying efficiency, one that prioritized defense and counterattack over showy strikes. Mr. Kim, the old instructor in the corner, felt a chill run down his spine. He recognized that guard. It wasn't from any sport. It was the empty cradle style, a defunct and lethal system used by elite security details in the late 90s, a style designed to end a fight in under 3 seconds. "Mr. Park," Sarah said softly, "you should sit down. You have people coming for dinner in an hour. It would be a shame if you couldn't greet them." The audacity of the statement was a spark in a powder keg. Park roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated pride, and launched a roundhouse kick aimed at her ribs. It was a powerful blow, one that would have snapped the bones of an average person. Sarah didn't block it with her arms. She stepped into the arc of the kick, closing the distance before the leg could reach its maximum velocity. She placed one palm on his hip and the other on his chest, using a gentle, rhythmic shove that timed perfectly with his own weight transfer. Park didn't fly across the room. He simply folded. His supporting leg gave way, and he collapsed onto his side, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp whoosh. He lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, the black belt draped across his hip like a discarded ribbon. The witnesses didn't move. They didn't breathe. They were watching a goddess of war disguised in a blue maid's uniform, and for the first time in their lives, they felt the cold hand of true reverence. The tension in the room had spiraled into something crystalline and fragile. Park scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of his men who followed him because they feared his strength. Now, that fear was being replaced by a devastating realization. Their leader was being dismantled by a woman they had spent years ignoring. "Shut up. All of you, shut up," Park screamed, though no one was making a sound. He turned back to Sarah, his eyes bloodshot. He reached into the waistband of his GI, his hand hovering near the small of his back, where he usually kept a concealed blade. The room gasped. This was no longer a spar. It was a desperate man trying to erase a witness to his weakness. "Boss, don't." June called out, but it was too late. Park lunged, his hand whipping forward. Sarah's reaction was a blur of blue fabric and brown skin. She didn't wait for the strike. She moved with a controlled dominance that made Park's aggression look like the flailing of a child. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, her thumb pressing into a specific nerve cluster. The blade, a small, ceramic folding knife, clattered to the mat. She didn't stop there. She stepped behind him, her arms snaking around his neck in a loose, non-threatening hold that nonetheless rendered him completely immobile. She wasn't squeezing, she was simply occupying the space where he needed to move. "The problem with pride, Mr. Park," she whispered into his ear, her voice audible to the entire front row of stunned henchmen, "is that it makes you predictable. You rely on the fear of others to keep you upright. Without it, you are just a man who doesn't know how to fall." She released him with a gentle push, and Park slumped to his knees, his head bowed. He wasn't hurt, but he was broken. The instructor, Mr. Kim, finally walked forward. He didn't go to Park. He stopped 3 feet from Sarah and bowed, a deep, 90-degree bow reserved for masters of the highest order. "I thought you were dead," Kim said, his voice trembling. "The lioness of soul. They said you retired after the palace coup." Sarah wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, the quiet Maid returning to her face like a mask being lowered. "I did retire, Kim. I just wanted a quiet life. I like the smell of bleach. It's cleaner than the alternative." She looked at the room of men, who were now standing, not out of aggression, but out of a desperate, newfound respect. "The floor is clean now," she said simply. "Make sure you don't track mud on it when you leave." She picked up her tray, walked to the door, and disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind a room of men who would never look at a servant the same way again. The dojo remained silent for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock, marking the seconds of a world that had just been irrevocably changed. The silence following Sarah's departure was not the silence of an empty room, but the heavy, vibrating quiet of a cathedral after a thunderclap. Park remained on his knees, his hands trembling as they rested on the mat he had once claimed to own. He stared at the ceramic knife, the weapon he had drawn in a moment of cowardly desperation, now lying discarded like a piece of common trash. His henchmen, usually so quick to offer a hand or a shouted word of encouragement, stood like statues carved from ice. They weren't looking at Park with the usual fear. They were looking at the doorway through which the lioness had vanished, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and sudden, profound enlightenment. June, the hothead who had mocked her mop only minutes prior, took a step back, his heel catching on the edge of the mat. The stumble seemed to break the spell. "Boss," he whispered, his voice cracking, but he didn't move to help. He saw the way Park's shoulders shook, the way the black belt seemed to shrink in the presence of a woman who didn't even need a title to command the room. "Mr. Kim," the instructor, remained in his deep bow long after Sarah had left the room. He knew what the others were only beginning to grasp. They hadn't just seen a fight. They had seen a ghost of a forgotten era, a master who had chosen the life of a servant over the life of a killer. "Do not move," Kim commanded, his voice regaining its authority, though it was now tempered with a strange, somber reverence. "None of you are worthy to stand on this mat today. You came here to learn how to hurt people. She stayed here to teach you how to be human." He looked down at Park, who finally looked up, his eyes hollowed out by the sudden vacuum of his own ego. The joke had ended, and in its place was a cold, hard truth that none of them could unsee. The confrontation forced a shift in the dojo's gravity that felt physical. For the next hour, no one spoke. The henchmen began to move, but not with their usual swagger. They picked up their gear with hushed, hurried movements, avoiding each other's eyes as if the shame of their collective laughter was a contagious disease. Park had retreated to the shadows of the locker room, leaving the main floor to the silence and the ghost of Sarah's presence. It was then that a third party intervened. The elder, a man named Han, who was the silent benefactor of the syndicate, arrived for his weekly inspection. He was a man of 80, walking with a cane, his eyes milky with age, but sharp with intuition. He stopped at the edge of the mat, his nostrils flaring. He didn't look at the disarray or the lingering tension, he looked at the floor. He saw the slight scuff marks where Sarah had pivoted, and he saw the discarded knife. "Who was here?" Han asked, his voice a dry rasp that commanded instant stillness. Mr. Kim stepped forward, his head lowered. "The maid, sir."
"Sarah. She
sparred with Park. Han's eyes widened, a flash of recognition crossing his weathered face. He walked to the spot where Sarah had stood and touched the mat with the tip of his cane. "You didn't call her Sarah," Han whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You called her by her true name, didn't you? You called her the lioness." The room went even colder. The younger men looked at Han, then at Kim, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into a terrifying whole. "She wasn't just a maid," Han continued, turning to the crowd. 20 years ago, she was the reason the Blue House didn't fall. She was the shadow that protected the people you think you're better than. And she chose to clean your floors because she thought you were worth saving from your own arrogance." The revelation hit the men like a physical blow. The woman they had treated as furniture was a living legend, a person whose history was written in the blood of those far more dangerous than any of them. The showdown had reached its psychological peak, but the lesson was only beginning. Park finally emerged from the locker room, no longer wearing his white GI. He was dressed in a simple suit, his head bowed, his movements hesitant. He walked toward the elder, but his eyes were searching the hallway. He found her in the small break room, sitting on a plastic chair, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea. She had already put her shoes back on. The silver bird pin on her collar caught the light of the flickering fluorescent bulb. Park stopped at the doorway, the man who had ordered hits and broken bones now looking like a schoolboy facing a principal. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah didn't look up from her tea. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me like a person, Mr. Park. That is the failure. You only respect what you fear." The words were quiet, devoid of anger, which made them cut deeper than any strike. Park stood there for a long minute, the weight of his own cruelty pressing down on him. He realized that for 3 years, he had been walking past a master, mocking a woman who could have ended his life with a flick of her wrist, and she had responded by making sure his water was cold and his towels were clean. It was a level of discipline he couldn't even fathom. "What do I do?"
Park asked.
Sarah finally looked at him, her eyes steady and ancient. "You start by picking up the trash," she said. "And tomorrow, you arrive at 5 a.m., not to train. To scrub." The demand was a total reversal of power, a public humiliation turned into a path for redemption. A Mafia boss being told to do the work of a maid, and for the first time in his life, Park didn't feel the urge to strike back. He felt a desperate, clawing need to earn the right to stand in her shadow. The aftermath was a slow-burn montage of a community in flux. The next morning, The sun hadn't even breached the horizon when the heavy iron doors of the dojo creaked open. Park was there, but he wasn't alone. 5 of his highest-ranking henchmen were with him, all of them stripped of their expensive watches and silk shirts, wearing plain gray sweats. They didn't go to the mats to kick bags. They went to the supply closet. Sarah was already there, handing out buckets and mops with the same detached, professional calm she had shown for years. No one spoke. The only sound was the sloshing of soapy water and the rhythmic scrubbing of brushes against wood. The arrogance that had defined the dojo was being washed away, layer by layer. The younger fighters who arrived later that morning stopped at the door, paralyzed by the sight of their feared leader on his hands and knees, scrubbing the very spot where he had fallen. They didn't laugh. They didn't cheer. One by one, they set down their gym bags, took off their shoes, and asked for a cloth. The culture of the syndicate was changing, not through a lecture, but through the quiet, crushing weight of Sarah's example. She didn't supervise them with a whip. She simply worked alongside them, her movements a masterclass in humility. The silver bird pin stayed on her collar, a silent reminder of the power she held in reserve, a power she chose not to use as a weapon, but as a mirror. As the weeks passed, the dojo transformed from a place of ego into a place of genuine study. The laughter was gone, replaced by a focused, reverent silence. Park never put his black belt back on. He wore a white belt, the mark of a beginner, and he sat at the back of the class. The maid's uniform remained Sarah's primary attire, but the way the men moved around her had changed. They cleared a path when she walked by, not out of fear, but out of a quiet, soul-deep reverence. One evening, after the cleaning was done, Sarah left a small object on the center of the mat, the ceramic knife Park had tried to use. It had been cleaned and polished, its blade dulled so it could never hurt anyone again. It sat there as a symbol, a lingering reminder of the day the joke died, and a group of men finally learned how to stand tall by first learning how to kneel. The community had been sobered, the loud arrogance of the Mafia replaced by the quiet competence of those who know that true strength doesn't need to shout. Sarah walked out into the cool night air, the dark blue of her uniform blending into the shadows. She had a long walk home, and there was more work to be done tomorrow. But as she looked back at the glowing windows of the dojo, she saw the silhouettes of men working together to maintain the space she had taught them to respect. The lioness was at peace, not because she had won a fight, but because she had won a soul. Before we close this chapter on hidden mastery, ask yourself, who in your life are you overlooking? Hit that follow button to see more stories of quiet strength.